So it's lesson 10, part 2. We're going to continue with unit testing. We're basically done with our unit tests of our home controller. So we're going to make a new test file. What's typically done, as you can see, we have a home controller in our web project, so we have a home controller test file. Rather than writing all our unit tests in one file, we usually create separate files for testing each controller. So down here in my test project under controllers, I'm going to right-click controllers. I'm going to add a new item. And under test, we just want an empty unit test class declaration. So I just click test over here. Down at the bottom of my Visual C#, click test, unit test, and we'll call it store manager controller test. So the same name as the file it's testing, except it's got the word test on the end. Click add. Now there's a bunch of stuff here we can get rid of. We can get rid of actually everything from underneath our public class store manager controller test. We'll just keep those last two brackets down at the bottom. Just get rid of all that stuff. We're going to write our own test methods here. So your file should just look like this. It can even get rid of that description. Kind of an empty class. Just looks like a regular file, except it's got test class here. Now we need to add some references so that we can access and use the store manager controller in our MVC project. So required references. We need system.web.mvc. And we need to reference our music store controllers. Otherwise, we can't see the store manager controller without referencing that. So let's try and write a similar index unit test like our home controller had that just calls the index method and checks if we get a view back. So we'll arrange, act, oops. Guess I need a test method first. Test method. So we just want to check whether we can call the index view in our controller. We're going to create an instance of our store manager. So far, this looks just like the index of our home test. Create an instance of the controller, call index and load the view result and make sure it's not null. We're going to get a result as a view result. And we want to check that we actually get a view back when we call index. So this is the identical unit test to our home index. We're just using our store manager controller this time. We're not using the home controller. Now, the other thing you've probably noticed, there's some redundancy in all the unit tests we've been writing, right? In all of our unit tests in the home controller, in every single test, we created an instance of the home controller. So we've repeated this line over and over again. There's a way that we can just initialize that in every test, so we don't have to repeat that line of code every time. So now we've got, if you build your solution, we have one new test that we haven't run yet. So we can try and run this test. Now, when we run it, we get a different result than when we ran the index test in our home controller. How come this fails? The method exists. We have an index method, and the index method returns a view result. But our error is over here on the left, and you probably have the same error in your project. Why did it fail?
We don't have access to the connection string in the web config file.
Right. Our store manager controller, as soon as we load it, what does it do? Connects to our database. The problem is the connection string is only visible inside of our web project. Our test project can't see it. So when we try to use the controller, but we don't have a connection string in our solution, it fails. It says, well, you can't use the store manager controller unless you also have a database connection. Now, this becomes kind of a problem. This is a bit of an architecture problem, because unit tests are designed where we just want to test the logic in a method. We don't want to test the database as well. That's a different kind of test. That's called an integration test, where we're testing how two different parts of the application are working together. How is the MVC web application talking to the database? And are those things working? We still want to do that kind of testing, but that's at a higher level, those integration tests. That's not one method at a time. The problem is, so we could get rid of that error, we need somehow to take the database connection and move it out of here. So our controller can still use the database connection, but the way it is right now, we can't run any unit tests. And we don't want to involve the database in our unit tests. So we're going to need a strategy for this. Here's the strategy. So this video link is on Blackboard. That's that hour-long tutorial. So this is what we have right now, and I've kind of taken these images out of that video tutorial. So right now we have a controller. Our controller references our DB context. That's this file, our music store model. That handles our database connection using Entity Framework. So right now, every time you access the controller, it automatically connects to the database. The problem is we can't unit test that way. We want to use the controller, but we don't want it to use that stuff on our unit test. So what are we going to do instead? It's kind of a few-part process. The first thing is we're going to move this database context that right now lives here. We're going to break this out and put it in a separate file. So we're going to insert a file in between called a repository. So now we can use our controller, but we don't have to connect to the database automatically. The next thing we want to do for unit testing is we want to access our controller and tell the repository, instead of connecting to the database, we want to use mock data instead. What do I mean? What does that mean, mock? What would mock data be? Yeah, we want to use fake data instead. So we want to use our store manager controller, but we'll just create maybe a few albums in memory, like local storage, and work with those because we don't want to connect to Entity Framework and SQL Server when we're unit testing. So we can do this for unit testing, But we don't want to break the web application. When a user's running the live application, we still want to use the database. So we don't want to be we basically take the controller and we'll create two versions of the repository. Our mock one that uses fake data, just albums we create in C# code. And then the other one that uses the real database. So the one in green, that path will still be the default. Most of the time when we use our controller, we'll assume the user is actually a user using the web application and they want real data from our SQL server. But we want to be able to say when we use the controller, hey, we're just faking the data, we're mocking it, so don't go down here, just go over here and use the fake stuff instead. So we need to rewrite the controller so that it can use either one of these, real data when we're needed, fake data when we're unit testing. That will allow us to write unit tests for our methods that don't talk to the database. But we have to kind of, we got to break the controller to do this. And we've got to create these files. To do this is by using this package called Moq. So Moq is available as part of the NuGet package gallery. We want to add this to our test project, and that will allow us to create mock or fake data for use with our unit tests. So on Blackboard, if you click on this link under Moq, Mocking Framework for Unit Testing, click the first one that goes to nuget.org/packages/mock. So just click that link, it'll take you here. So this is the package we want to use. Now we could install it through the package manager. The easiest way to do this is actually just click on this orange copy button. Here's the install command. So click on that, it'll copy it. And then go back to Visual Studio. Click on Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and open the Package Manager console. Looks like a little command window within Visual Studio. You can see the menu tree, Tools, Package Manager Console. Sorry, Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Package Manager Console. So click that, and we'll get this little window opening here. Now make sure, notice the default project, it defaults back to our web application. So we want to change this to our test project. We don't want to install this package in the web application. We want to install the package in the test project. So under default project, change that drop down so it says test project. And then you can right click and paste that command and hit enter. It will install Moq and it will install a few other packages that Moq needs. You can close the console when you're done. And then to check it, if I go to Solution Explorer and expand the references here, you'll now see a package called Castle, and you'll see Moq in here as well. So now we can use this package to create fake data. So now what we need to do is we need to start creating, we need to create two different repositories. We're going to add two files. The first one for mocking and the second one for using the real database. And this process where At runtime, when the application runs, we pass whichever object is needed. We either pass the mock object to the controller, or we pass the real one that uses the database. This is a process known as dependency injection. So we're giving one object exactly what it needs in the moment. So we're going to create these two repositories. So in your web project, you can expand your models folder. So I want you to right-click models and choose Add, a new item, and choose Code. And what we want is what's called an interface. And we're going to name this one Store Manager Repository. So this will be our interface for working with mock data. It won't connect to the database, but it will allow us to simulate, create, read, update, and delete transactions with pretend data. We need to add here the word public. So this will be our repository for mock album data for unit testing. That's the purpose of this. So when we write a save method, we won't really save anything. We just want to be able to call that method. So in here, we have a list of albums. That we can get, that we can read. We also have a list of artists. Because we have a relationship between albums and artists. We can't have an album without an artist. And we also can't have an album without a genre. And all of these should be plural. So now we're going to create our two fake methods, a fake save method and a fake delete method. So this file won't connect to the database. It's just going to work with pretend or mock album data. So now we need to write another version of this, but this version will actually talk to our database and do our create, read, and update and delete. And then we're going to modify our controller so it can use either interface. It could use mock data or it could use the real one. So there's our mock file. Now in our models, I want you to add a class, not an interface, but a class. And we're going to call this one EF Store Manager Repository. You can call it anything you like. The name's not that important. EF standing for Entity Framework, meaning this is the one that's going to actually talk to the database. The one we already built is the mock one. This is the live one. So it gives us this definition. And here, We're going to make this a child of the other one. Whoops. So I've added this. And it's complaining because it's saying if this is a child of the other, it needs all the things the other one has. So it says here, show potential fixes. When I mouse over this little red error, when I click this, it says here, do you want to implement this other file? I'll just double click it. And then it copies some code basically from the other file in. We'll need to make some changes, but so this is the repository we're going to move the database connection out of our controller and put it in here instead. Because the controller doesn't always need the database. If we're unit testing, it's using mock data. The DB connection is moved here from Store Manager controller. We need to reference oh, whoops. There's stuff in the wrong place. Sorry. Go here. We're moving our database connection into this file. It no longer will be in our controller. So now we're going to change what's here. For the albums, we'll populate the list by just calling db.albums. We'll do the same for artists and same for genres. So now our delete and save that Visual Studio generated, they say throw not implemented. We can get rid of those and we'll just write the code. So for delete, we only need 2 lines, db.albums.remove and save. We're kind of moving some of this code out of the controller into this file. Now, instead of having separate create and edit methods, we just have a save method. And we can write the logic whether this method does a create or does an edit. So if our album ID is 0, we'll add a new album. Otherwise, we just mark the Now this method can do both insert or update, just checks for an ID. If the ID is 0, we're inserting, otherwise we're marking it as modified. And then we just return the object back. So now we've written 2 versions of the repository. This one that will work with mock data, and this file that will now get a list of albums, as well as do create, update, delete. We haven't actually changed a thing in our controller yet, though. If we write our unit test, if we run our unit test, it's still going to fail after all this work. I'll just build. So I'm going to go back and run my unit tests again. We still got the same problem. When we try to run this test, it still fails with the same error, because we haven't actually changed anything in our controller. Super. I'll let that restart. So now what we need to do is make this change. We need to change the controller to say, hey, when we tell you we're giving you mock data, use the mock file we just made. And if we don't tell you we're using the mock, use the one that talks to the database instead. So our default path is still going to be use the database unless we tell the controller we're using mock data. So we're going to have to start modifying our controller. So we'll open our controller. The first thing we're going to do is we have to comment out our database connection. That's why we keep getting this error. We don't always want to automatically connect to the database. When we're running a unit test, we don't want the database. DB connection, move to models. Okay, we've moved it there. Now, when I comment that out, obviously that breaks all of their methods, right? Because they're all expecting to use that DB. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make it so this DB could represent this object, or it could represent that object. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to redeclare DB as something else. I'm still going to use the word DB. Notice all my methods work again now. All my red lines go away. With no mock specified, use the database. So when we create the controller, whoops, sorry, should be new. So by default, if we don't tell the controller we're just doing mock data, use the file that connects to the database. That's one version. If we tell the controller we are testing, use the mock interface. So this one looks like this. So whenever we create the controller, we're creating it with one of two versions. If we pass in mock data, it knows, hey, we're mocking, use this file. Otherwise, if we pass nothing and use the one that talks to the database instead. So now we've kind of set up this path. Our controller can go this way, or it can go that way. So we don't have to change any of the code in our MVC application. Our views that we're already using now, they'll still talk to the database. Just to make sure we haven't broken anything, let's build. And I'm going to load, I want to load this in the browser, make sure I can still log in my store manager, all my views still work. Okay, well, we got some issues. So what it's saying is, you're going to have to change some stuff here. Okay. So temporarily, for now, we just want to try and get our index method to load. So what I'm actually going to do, so index is here on line 33 to 34. It ends right here. Temporarily, I'm going to comment out all the other methods in the controller. We just want to modify index first and write unit tests for that and get it working. We're not going to be able to write unit tests for all of these today. So starting here at the post store manager, I'm going to comment everything out just for now. I'll just leave those last two curly brackets. So I'm just going to comment that whole section. Now it says, like, I get no errors here. I should be able to build, hopefully. We'll put back as much of that stuff as we can. So when index is the only method in here, I can build. And I should be able to log in and run my store manager index, and hopefully all the albums still show up from our database.